It's a chilly morning in the 13th century France. Mist clings to the cobblestones as thousands gather in the fields outside the town of Troyes, France. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, freshly baked bread, and the sharp tang of spices carried all the way from the east. Merchants shout their prices. Silk traders unfurl dazzling bolts of cloth, and the metallic clink of coins never seems to stop. Now, just beyond the fairground, bells ring out from the monastery. Monks shuffle in their long robes, heads bowed, muttering prayers. For them, this noise, this chaos of buying and selling, is dangerously close to sin. After all, shouldn't men be thinking about God, not profit? And yet, this clash between holy men and hustlers, between monks and merchants, didn't just shape one market. It set the stage for an economic revolution that would change Europe forever. How did a bustling fair in medieval France become the birthplace of modern banking? How did humble merchants challenge the power of monasteries, institutions that had controlled wealth for centuries? And why did the church, which preached poverty, find itself neck-deep in the world of trade and money? In this episode, we're traveling back in time to uncover the strange, fiery, and often violent rivalry between merchants and monks. A rivalry that transformed the medieval marketplace and planted the seeds of capitalism itself. Stay tuned, because by the end of this story, you'll see why a simple market in Champagne was one of the most important battlegrounds in European history. By the 12th century, Europe was waking up. The long shadow of the Dark Ages was beginning to lift, and towns that had once been little more than muddy crossroads were bursting into life. Roads were safer, kings were stronger, and suddenly, goods could move in ways they hadn't for centuries. And nowhere was this more visible than at the great medieval markets. In Champagne, France, 4 enormous fairs turned this quiet region into the economic heartbeat of Europe. Here, Italian bankers from Florence rubbed shoulders with Flemish clothmakers. Traders from Venice and Genoa hauled in pepper, cinnamon, and silk from the east, while German merchants unloaded barrels of beer, iron, and furs. It was chaotic, it was noisy, and it was revolutionary. These markets weren't just about buying and selling. They became the meeting points of cultures, ideas, and money. A merchant from Pisa could strike a deal with a clothmaker from Bruges, pay with a bill of exchange written in Latin, and have it honored by a banker back in Italy. Contracts, credit, and partnerships were born here. For the first time in centuries, Europe was weaving together a truly international economy. But not everyone welcomed this new world. For generations, the monks and monasteries had been the guardians of wealth. They owned the land, controlled the harvest, and preserved knowledge inside their scriptoria. In their eyes, profit was dangerous, and moneylending was a sin. Yet here came the merchants, rewriting the rules. They built fortunes not from prayer or land, but from risk, calculation, and opportunity. They saw the world not as a sacred order, but as a web of markets to be conquered. And so, Europe found itself at a crossroads. Would power remain with the church, or shift to these daring traders? The stage was set for conflict, and the battles between merchants and monks were only just beginning. When we think of monks today, we picture quiet men in robes, heads bowed in prayer, cut off from the world. But in the Middle Ages, monasteries were anything but isolated retreats. They were economic giants. A monastery wasn't just a chapel surrounded by walls, it was an entire estate. Monks owned vast fields of farmland, managed vineyards, and collected rents from peasants who worked their lands. They brewed beer and sold it, copied and sold manuscripts, and even ran mills and bakeries. Some monasteries controlled bridges, ports, and roads, charging tolls for anyone who passed. In many regions, monks dominated the local economy. They set grain prices, they taxed markets, they even lent money, all while preaching against greed. For a medieval villager, the monastery wasn't just a house of God. It was landlord, employer, tax collector, and banker rolled into one. And here's where the tension exploded. Traveling merchants, who risked everything to haul goods across Europe, began to see the monks as hypocrites. Weren't these men supposed to live lives of poverty and prayer? Instead, they looked suspiciously like wealthy landlords in robes. Take this story from Flanders. A group of Italian spice merchants once arrived at a local fair, only to be stopped at the gates. The monastery that owned the land demanded a toll so high it would wipe out the merchants' profit. The traders argued, saying they had already paid dues to the town and the count who protected them. But the abbot stood firm. He controlled the road, and no wagon would pass without his fee. The dispute turned ugly. Merchants threatened to boycott the fair altogether, and eventually, secular lords had to step in. Because without trade, even the monks' tolls were worthless. It was a stark reminder that Europe was changing, and monasteries could no longer squeeze merchants at will. This clash between spiritual authority and commercial ambition wasn't just about tolls. It was about who controlled the future of Europe. And soon, the battles would get even sharper, over holy days, money lending, and the very morality of profit itself. By the 13th century, the rivalry between merchants and monks wasn't just simmering. It was boiling over. What began as quiet disapproval turned into open conflict, played out in markets, fairs, and even pulpits. One of the biggest clashes came down to time itself. The church insisted that markets shut down on Sundays and feast days, sacred times reserved for worship. But merchants, who had traveled weeks or even months to reach a fair, refused to let a holy calendar cut into their profits. Stalls stayed open, money changed hands, and the ringing of church bells was often drowned out by the sound of bargaining. To the monks, this was sacrilege. To the merchants, it was survival. Then came the issue of money lending. The church condemned usury, charging interest on loans, as a mortal sin. Yet merchants couldn't expand trade without credit. So Italian bankers in Florence and Venice invented clever loopholes, disguising interest as fees, creating complex contracts, and quietly building the foundations of modern banking. Monks thundered from the pulpits about the sin of greed. But when abbeys themselves needed cash, they often borrowed from the very bankers they condemned. Meanwhile, merchants pioneered innovations that looked suspiciously like sorcery to the monastic eye. Contracts, bills of exchange, even double-entry bookkeeping. With these tools, wealth could move across Europe without ever touching a bag of coins. Monks warned that such tricks endangered souls. Merchants shrugged and got richer. Nowhere was this tug-of-war clearer than at the Champagne fairs. These markets were protected by powerful counts who guaranteed merchants safe passage, fair courts, and armed protection. Under this shield, trade exploded. Flemish cloth, Italian credit, Eastern spices, all flowing together. The monks disapproved, denouncing the fairs as dens of greed, but their words carried little weight when the count stood behind the traders. At Champagne, the merchants had won a decisive victory. But this was only the beginning. With each clash, over holy days, over money, over the very meaning of morality, the balance of power was shifting. And soon, Europe itself would be transformed. By the late Middle Ages, the battle lines were clear, and the merchants were winning. What began as temporary fairs in muddy fields had grown into permanent towns. All across Europe, bustling cities like Bruges, Florence, and Venice sprang up along trade routes. Streets once ruled by monasteries now echoed with the sound of hammers, coins, and the chatter of foreign tongues. At the heart of these towns were merchant guilds. They weren't just trade associations, they were political powerhouses. Guilds wrote laws, enforced quality standards, and even fielded militias to protect their interests. In some towns, the guild halls rivaled cathedrals in size and splendor. Where once abbots and bishops had dictated the rules, now merchants set them. And then came the bankers. Families like the Medici in Florence or the Lombards in northern Italy didn't just lend money. They financed kings, popes, and wars. An abbot might control a valley, but a Medici banker could sway the fate of an entire kingdom. Money, not prayer, had become the new source of influence. But here's the twist. Instead of resisting forever, the church began to adapt. Monasteries that once thundered against greed quietly invested in trade themselves. Some even partnered with merchants, leasing their lands, storing goods, or lending coin. The line between monk and merchant blurred, as survival meant joining the very system they once condemned. Europe had changed. The marketplace, noisy, chaotic, and secular, had become more powerful than the cloister. Merchants didn't just sell goods, they reshaped society, politics, and faith itself. And as their power grew, the seeds of something even bigger, the Renaissance and the birth of modern capitalism, were already beginning to sprout. Out of the noisy stalls of medieval markets and the echoing halls of monasteries, a new Europe was born. The clash between merchants and monks gave rise to ideas that still shape our world today. The pursuit of profit, the beginnings of capitalism, and the financial innovations that would one day fuel global trade. The monasteries, once towering centers of wealth and authority, began their slow decline. In their place, cities rose. Bruges, Florence, Venice, pulsing with energy, commerce, and ambition. No longer was Europe's fate dictated solely by cloisters and cathedrals. It was decided in counting houses, guild halls, and marketplaces. Without this struggle, without the fierce contest of merchants versus monks, there may have been no Renaissance, no Medici banks funding artists and scholars, perhaps no modern banking system at all. What started as a fight over tolls, feast days, and fair rights ended up reshaping the destiny of a continent. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the markets of medieval Europe. If you'd like to hear more stories where faith, power, and greed shaped history, be sure to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss an episode.